think I should be in.
Yep. Okay, we've got the recording started. So I'll just kick us off with a little overview of what the session is going to entail. So we've got Dr. Cameron Murray here. He's an economist who's going to talk to us a little bit about his work in the field of economics. And so we're going to spend the first maybe 20, 25 minutes. He'll be interviewed by Justin Verley, who's a teacher at Brisbane State High School. And then there will be an opportunity for a question and answer from any of the participants with Dr. Murray. And then we'll wrap up the session with a quick a Q&A for the Australian Economics Olympiad, if there are any questions around that. So I'll just give a quick intro into Dr. Murray. Dr. Murray is an economist with a PhD from the University of Queensland. He's worked with the Queensland government, the private sector, at universities, and now runs his own think tank and consulting business called Fresh Economic Thinking. He's the author for 2 books, Rigged, which is about the economics and costs of political favoritism and was co-authored with Paul Freiters, and The Great Housing Hijack, which is about housing markets and the political economy of housing policy. So as I mentioned, we've got Justin Verley, an economics teacher at Brisbane State High School, who's here to give a quick interview of Dr. Murray. So I will leave it over to you two.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Gray. Yes, and thank you, Dr. Murray, for joining us. I suppose we should probably just get right into it, because the most exciting thing for students is to kind of learn a little bit about what real economists, actual economists, people who are done with high school, who are done with uni, who are more or less done with academia, and they're doing proper work, or they've done proper work, and they're researching, and they're writing, and they're producing. Normally, Cameron, as we sort of chatted about before, I would start with sort of the basics about, why you first developed your interests. But since you are, deep into the discussion of the housing crisis, and I'm sure economics students all over the country would have their views and their growing expertise in the housing market. Perhaps we start with the meat of this. Would you be able to give a little bit of a summary as to the work you've been doing recently, the housing hijack? Just a bit of a summary there, just to kind of kick us off.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Justin, and thanks everyone for dialing in on your Saturday afternoon. It's lovely to be here, and yes, housing, isn't that a topic of the moment? Very good timing for this book, not unintentional. But yeah, so what I've been doing the last 4 years, so since 2019, I got a job at the University of Sydney as a research fellow. So a research fellow is basically an academic who doesn't have to teach, who just gets to write and research whatever they like. Can everyone hear me? Just yell out, by the way, because I can't see anyone. And I may just go off on a tangent and leave you all behind.
Yeah,
so I spent 4 years, and what does an academic economist do when they don't have to teach? Well, they write lots of papers, they do lots of analysis on any sorts of data they can get their hands on that I think could provide an interesting insight that illuminates some open question. And one of the big questions in housing is, why does it always seem like there aren't enough homes? Why, like, we don't have a problem building homes. We've been building houses for thousands of years. So why does there never seem like there are enough? And so my very small niche, and this is what happens in academia, you get a very small niche and a very small question you become very expert in, is what determines the equilibrium rate of new housing supply. So the rate per period of time at which the option to develop is taken up across property owners in the market as a whole. And that's my niche. And so I've got theoretical papers on that. I've for example, collated data from annual reports and historical financial records of major property developers. I even went to the archives in Queensland. So you have to book to go to the historical records and find the property titles from the 1850s. And you get your microfilm in the library and you read off basically handwritten scribbles in a ledger that was the property title system of Queensland in the 1850s. And I transcribed all those records to do some sort of analysis of the prices back then. And I, for example, did some analysis of archaeological translations of property sales records from stone tablets from ancient Mesopotamia in like 500 BC or 2000 to 500 BC. And these were all my, interesting attempts at bringing data to the question of what's going on with housing supply. And so the book, The Great Housing Hijack, it's not a textbook. It's sort of for popular consumption. It's like a bit of a Freakonomics type book about why our housing debate seems hijacked and who's got certain interests in controlling the debate. Obviously, my first book was about political favoritism, and so fits neatly with that. But it was really a chance for me to explain to a broader audience all the findings from these very detailed research studies that I'd done in the 4 years prior, and how that linked with my experience prior to that, working in property, investing in property, and to really just lay out, here's what I think is the state of play, and here's my best knowledge about housing, and hopefully we can improve the quality of the public conversation. And I really think economists do have a role in keeping the standard up of public conversation about important topics like housing. And so, yeah, I want to participate in that for sure.
Fantastic. Just for our curiosity, one more question, I suppose, with the housing market. Most students around the state, most people around the country would be aware that there's a supply and demand and certain incentives and construction and the political.
Mm-hmm.
In your research, would you be able to, how much of the issue or how much of the problem, because especially most places do seem to be having a bit of a housing shortage around the globe. Is there much of the, whether it's rental crises or inflation or housing, that is unique to Australia, like maybe either from a policy perspective or something else?
That's a really interesting question, Justin, because the answer is kind of no. Australia, this is, I think, where economists can bring a lot of value, right? If it's your day-to-day job to be an expert in a certain area, you're going to be forced to look abroad and look historically and really read up on that knowledge, because most people don't have the time for that. And so what happens in the policy debate is we keep recycling the same things because no one remembers what happened 5 years ago. No one's paid attention to what's happening in Canada, New Zealand, the US, Singapore, Japan, you name it. And so we're always looking at our nose, and we also get a bit swept up in blaming our political enemies for any economic outcomes. Why are house prices going up? Oh, it's because Labor's in power and it's their problem. I'm like, well, you used to be in power. And secondly, there's all sorts of governments in power around the world having exactly the same conversation, blaming their political enemies. So can we just concentrate on the economic questions at hand and push that to the side? And I do feel like I spend a lot of time just pushing to the side. Okay, someone said that and it sounds really juicy and it's good media, but can we just, that politician has their incentive, put that to the side and go, what's the real question here? There's a lot of defining the question, defining the problem, that I think economists are generally pretty good at compared to other social scientists. So I think there is a role there in the public debate. And to be honest, a lot of consulting work that I've done as an economist, people, organizations think they know what their problem is, and they ask you to tell them how to fix the problem they have, but they actually don't know what their problem is. And you always have to be aware that they've asked you for a solution to a problem, but they might actually not know that this is the problem causing that, this is the cause of that problem. They might have assumed that and asked you to, how do we address this? But you've got to take those extra steps and spend a bit more time unpicking. And so, that's been a lot of my career, is really like, what's the real problem here? Because I think well-trained social scientists should be the experts in doing that, and I see it as a role for economists for sure.
Yes, wonderful. I love you framing economics as a social science, introducing or maintaining the connection to the people, and it is very much a social science. When economists tend to get associated mostly with statisticians or with finance,
Yeah.
and the human element is quite strong.
Yeah, you're right. A lot of people ask me, what should I invest in? You're an
Mm,
economist. And I go, that's not the question they ask. I
yes,
think all I do is think about opportunity cost every day. That's
yes,
like what an economist's
absolutely.
brain is.
Wonderful.
When someone says to me, oh, look, isn't this a good deal? I say, well, what's your next best alternative?
Depends.
I
Yes.
mean, like, there is no other question,
Yeah,
right? And should we do this? Okay, well, it depends what our alternatives are, right?
exactly.
If we've got better alternatives, maybe not. If we don't, then maybe we should.
Yeah,
So, so it's that exposing those hidden alternatives,
yeah,
and that again, uh, politically and within organizations, people often jump to what they think the problem is, but because they haven't spent time trying to articulate what could the alternatives be that we're missing out on.
yeah.
What have other organizations done? What is possible here? How much is the saving here? What are the alternative investments? Yeah, so that's what I think the huge value is. And the more different work I do, the more I see that it's actually a hard mindset for people to get into. And sometimes economists won't, that they'll get bogged down as well. And you've got to
Yes.
also bring them back and say, hang on, you're an economist, right? So
Yeah.
how should we think about this more coherently? It's very tricky.
Yes, absolutely. Um, I can't help but think of I've recently returned from a Canada trip over the Christmas holidays, and of course I was curious to see what their housing, situation is like. They have a very different system over there, whether it's, the highlight differences might be different systems of negative gearing, average length of mortgage rates, average quantities or
Hmm.
portions of commission housing, very, very different to here. And surprise, surprise, they also have a housing crisis and a rental price crisis. So we could change all of our policies to model another place, and it might be very much the
So
same. I might zoom out a little
yeah,
bit
yeah.
more, leave the housing a little bit because
Okay.
yeah, we'll change topics, change gears a little bit. We'll sort of go backtrack a little bit. Would you be able to sort of reflect on or kind of speak to the students a little bit about when, was it easy enough that it was in high school at the teenager sort of level that you first developed your interest in economics? Is it an easy story that you took it in high school and that was it, or did you discover it and.
Yeah, no, I didn't take economics in high school or university. I was into the sciences, started an engineering degree. I actually went straight out of high school into aerospace avionics at QUT, thinking I got good grades, may as well do something that's really hard, but no one, you
Yeah.
know, uh, no, if I've got the capability, may as well stretch myself and try
Hmm.
something.
Hmm.
And I did do that for a while. There's a lot of interesting things, but it's funny because at the time, this was the early 2000s. The property boom was just kicking off in 2000.
Mm.
Um, my dad had a few investment properties, and I sort of I took a gap year in the middle of engineering and came back, and I just realized there's so much money in this industry. Why would I slave away for years in this technical job when there's a guy out there selling real estate making a heap of money? And I spent a year in Canada just working in the ski fields and things. The motivation to go back to engineering wasn't there. So I thought I'll try to sell real estate, do a few different things. I really, selling, being a broker for trading houses was not my thing. I'm like, well, where's the money? Where's the interesting puzzle here of property? Why is that person paying 5 million for that development site? And why is that person paying 2 million for that site? And who's making more money and why? Like, that's the question I wanted to know. So I decided I should probably study a little more in property. So I did a property economics course at QT.
Oh,
That's
yes.
more about valuation and property development. So if you really are interested in property, it's a good course, and all the sort of institutions around property valuers, etc., are aware of that course. And that led me in my final year to get a job as I guess they call it a cadet or an apprenticeship type situation at FKP, which is now called Avio, which is a retirement village operator. But at the time, they were doing residential retirement and industrial projects. And so that's sort of where I got into things. I still, property economics is not really economics broadly. It's pretty niche. Having spent a while working there, I still had a lot of puzzling questions on my mind about economics. I was really into sustainability, environmental change, and how you can do that through developing different types of buildings and housing and different cities. And I was still tutoring some courses, and I approached a few professors and said, "Oh, I'm really interested in this question." They said, "You can do a master's degree and just go and do your own research if you want." So I said, "Okay, I'll do that now." And I think that was the time that I was like, "Whoa, okay, economics, this is interesting. There are so many interesting economic questions everywhere. You turn your back, and there's another question of like, my master's degree is in environmental economics, and the research I did was on the rebound effect. And so that's basically the offsetting consequences of trying to conserve energy by increasing demand for other sectors of the economy that require energy. So for example, if I ride my bike to work every day to, reduce my greenhouse gas emissions and conserve energy, well, I might save $50 a week, $2.5 grand a year, and I might spend that on a flight to Canada.
Yeah.
Okay, so instead of spending 2.5 grand on bus tickets and train tickets or whatever, I've spent 2.5 grand on a flight. Which one's better for the environment?
Mm.
And if we try and aggregate these behavioral changes that we think make sense on their surface, but then if we get into all the offsetting effects throughout all those economic interactions, maybe the consequences are much, much smaller than we think. We have to think a little bit differently about where to target interventions that actually scale up rather than get offset. And that sort of shift in thinking, realizing that the things we talk about every day are missing this really important economic element. Just, that's what got me more into it. So I actually ended up working in the state government a little while after that in water planning. So we were creating water trading schemes for groundwater access in different basins. Because one of the ideas is that we've got this old-fashioned licensing where you own a piece of land, you get to pump water, and that's it. Shouldn't the water move to its highest use if someone, on the down the road wants more water and you want less? Shouldn't you be able to trade the right because you're both drilling into the same aquifer?
Mm.
Shouldn't you be able to relocate the water within the aquifer and have trading to improve efficiency? And honestly, when you get into those details, it sort of makes sense on the surface, and you can get away with a bit of trading, but there was just a whole extra set of economic questions that came up. And I made some notes before we started, and this is where one of them is. So I was going to tell students, if you're intrigued by some of these puzzling questions, like why there are big companies and small companies, not just big ones, and why do airlines change their prices all the time? Here's a question. Why is it best to grow water-hungry crops like cotton in the desert? I mean, that's a weird question. It doesn't make sense, right? Your normal brain says, can't grow cotton in the desert. That's stupid. It's water-hungry crop. And then you spend a little bit of time and you realize, yeah, it's desert most of the time, but then every few years, it floods like crazy and everything's underwater. So you need a crop that you can not grow for a few years, and then once every decade or twice every decade, you can harvest heaps and heaps of water all at once, and the water doesn't last, right? Because it just evaporates, and then flood your crop with a real water-hungry crop that grows quick that you can harvest within 12 months. And then the next year, you don't grow any, right? And then so you're like, wow, okay, this is totally mind-blowing. You have water-hungry crops in the desert because the water supply is not low, it's low but enormously variable. And you want crops that can take the top off and then do nothing for a while. And, there's these hidden little secrets behind every part of our economy. Once you look, what makes no sense on the surface suddenly becomes really obvious if you just lay it out a few sensible questions. Well, what's the opportunity cost? Okay, you got heaps and heaps of water. All of a sudden, you want a hungry crop. Okay, now you've got no water. All of a sudden, you want something that it's not a perennial. It's not going to keep trying to grow through the dry
Mhm.
years. And it all sort of makes perfect sense. Anyway, now I'm rambling.
That's a fascinating example of just, yeah, what's the best way or the optimal way to use in this case, land, a natural resource, just being the actual acreage where you wouldn't be able to probably not have housing, probably not grow carrots or a typical classic industrial farming,
Yeah.
type of thing that you need something rare. Otherwise, all of that acreage, all of that land is just kind of wasted throughout the year.
Yeah, there's not many other places that you can have a drought for 5 years, then a flood for 1 or 2 and
Mm,
make things work, except a water-hungry crop that grows real fast, where you can just grab that water for a year and plant it, harvest it, and then leave it. Yeah,
excellent.
interesting.
Excellent. You sort of touched on this a little bit, so we might as well just bring it right to the surface for a bit of discussion. Oh, I should say before I forget, to any students who are involved in the chat, first of all, hello, thank you for joining us. You are welcome to submit questions in the chat function that you would like me to pass on to Dr. Cameron Murray, so that way he could answer. So feel free to do that. And we'll see. There's no pressure, of course, but if there is anything burning that you are curious in asking, feel free. Yeah. So the question we are going to bring up now, since you sort of touched on it, is what type of students? So we are thinking of primarily whether it's year 10, 11, and 12. They're working
Mm.
on they're working on their university applications. Maybe they're padding a resume, whether they're or maybe they're just it's the first time really kind of thinking of their career pathway. I like framing the
Mm.
question in this way. What type of student should pursue a career in economics? Or if you are this type of 16-year-old, if your brain works this way, if this is what you find interesting, you would really enjoy, find value, be satisfied or fulfilled if you took economics.
Oh,
Big question, I
yeah,
know.
that is tough because I had a lot of other things on my mind until I was probably 21 or 22,
Mm,
and really got into economics much more. And then I got really into it, and I was in the Young Economics Society and on the committee, and I do recommend whatever career you choose, get involved with the discipline.
mm.
I've found that very rewarding. Now I could just get anyone on the phone if I've got questions about something. Help me, I've got to do some research on this. Who should I talk to? Where should I start? Um, yeah, I think if you're curious about the world, if you're sort of open to discovery, and I do find economists are a mixed bag sometimes. Sometimes people, they learn economics and they think they've got the answer to everything
Mm,
because they've got supply and demand. And of course, prices adjust because buyers sell and sell, and sellers sell and buyers buy. But why? You know, why would you sell for that price and not a different price and wait for a higher price? So some economists I find sort of they go, great, now I'm going to go on a mission to show everyone how the world works. But I think if you're curious about unraveling the mystery of why does this work here? Like, why does this work? Things that sort of don't make sense. Why do airlines change the price all the time? Like, if you want to unravel and sort of go a layer deeper, and you've got an analytical mind that can sort of hold some abstract ideas together, and I think, yeah, economics can be very rewarding, and you can definitely pursue a lot of different interesting career paths. I know a lot of people who've worked for the World Bank or this OECD who've traveled to a lot of different countries and tried to, as I was saying earlier, unpick what the real problem is.
mm,
Certain cities, certain regions trying to develop. Well, is it the water? Do you need a dam? How would you use the dam? Is someone just going to steal the water if you build it? How do we regulate it? What's worked elsewhere?
mm,
If those sort of puzzles suit you and you're really open to, you know, proving yourself wrong many times over, which I've done, then yeah, I think there's so many good opportunities, and you'll be able to learn about just whether it's trading water in the desert, or you name it, conservation, other conservation policies or housing markets.
mm.
There's just so many opportunities. But yeah, you've got to. I think if you're not interested in the questions, and if you're a technical person, but you love building things, you're a tinkerer and a maker. Well, economists, we analyze and we try and unpick, but we don't, you don't get that satisfaction of looking at the bridge that you guys built. At the end of the day, you've got a report and maybe there's some insight, and maybe you see someone using your idea to make sense, and you watch them, they go, oh, we help them explain opportunity cost, and now I can see them have this conversation. So I'll give you an example. I'm actually doing FIFO economics teaching at a university in Saudi Arabia. So there's a new business school called Mohammed bin Salman College, and it's the Western Business School experience in Saudi Arabia. It's in English, mixed gender classrooms, foreign academics. And I found that a super interesting experience, because these ideas in economics, which are much more prevalent and common in Australia, because there's a lot of people with economics degrees, when you go there and you explain to these doctors, engineers, nurses, you name it, petrochemical engineers, there's a lot of them, some of these concepts, they're just like, whoa, you're joking. And then so I had a student come back to me. He was a doctor, and he's now on the management committee of the Saudi German hospital. And, it's a big private hospital in the country. And they were talking about pricing certain treatments. And we talked about pricing and how to maximize revenue and the price elasticity in class. And I said, well, sometimes you can put the price up and make less money, and sometimes you can put the price down and make more money, depending on the price sensitivity of your customers. And he's just like, it was totally new to him. And so at the end of the course, I came back and I went back to teach the final week. 3 weeks later, he said, you're not going to believe it. We had a meeting at the hospital board about this pricing thing, and I told them about opportunity cost, and I told them about price elasticity, and we sat down together with the numbers and said, look, we put the price up, or no, he said, we put the price down, and we got more treatments, but we made less money. And I said, we should put the price back up. And he was able to explain to the other people on the board, who were like, oh, we need to get more people in the door, right? And he's like, but you're making less money. You don't want to you're not in the business of losing money and treating everyone, because this was a private entity, right? And I was just like, to see that concept in his mind, changing the way they think about their hospital, it's going to change how they invest in new hospitals. It's going to, I was very proud, let's just say, that had made a difference.
Brilliant. Brilliant. We do have some pretty big questions coming in the chat. So thank you, Jasper and Ian. We'll start with Jasper's, first in best dressed, I suppose. There's a few different questions there. So Jasper, hopefully you're okay if I cherry pick a little bit. I'm mostly drawn to, I think students would mostly be drawn to at the beginning, during the process of going into economics, where there, was there anything in particular that you were scared of, or maybe bigger challenges? I might paraphrase this, and then possibly a simpler sub question, the tail end there. Do you have any books that you would recommend, possibly, particularly to the teenagers and the high school students in the room? So any initial challenges or things that kind of scared you a little bit as you got closer to your economics work, and any easy book recommendations?
These are good questions. Let me think about that. What was I scared of? I guess some people, it's probably different, but some people find that abstractions and putting social concepts into formulas a very weird thing at first. And I think that's a bit of a hurdle for some people, and you just have to get comfortable with that. It's 2024, you can go on YouTube. There's really great ways to just get those fundamental insights of what do they mean when they're going, it's a maximization problem. What do they mean here? Why would it be a maximization? Oh, okay, because if it's not, then you can voluntarily trade and both be better off and add to that joint surplus, and then until there's no trades left, in which case it's a maximization. So that can be a bit of a hurdle. I think in my master's degree, and all research, so if you end up doing an economics degree and doing an honours year, which I recommend if that's where you end up, anything can change. You can take gap years, you can travel the world, do whatever you want. And I definitely recommend all that. But at the end of the day, if you're doing an economics degree, the honours year, which is the fourth year at most of the universities in Australia, is very, very well regarded in government departments, the Reserve Bank, the Treasury. And it's a year where you get to do your own research on a topic that interests you. And that year and during my master's, and during any time you're doing research, the fear is that you find nothing, that you spend your whole time reading up on this subject matter. You still haven't really got to the nub of what the problem is or where that missing insight is. And you still don't know how you can illuminate something new about that subject area. So I think that's always a fear in research is, am I going to be able to contribute anything or learn anything besides what someone's written already? How do I do that? It's a skill once you've done it once, and that's why I think why the honours year is so valued. Once you've done it once, there's definitely a mental shift. Like, that's how we get new insights. Oh, that's what data can tell us. That's what this can show. So that's useful. Books. I read very, very niche books these days. I've got like the Handbook of Urban Economics was the current one up in my, I can tell you what I'm reading here. I've got a paper on housing supply. I've got a appendix number 4 of a Los Angeles housing study. I've got appendix number 3 of a New Zealand housing study. And what other books have I got here? There was one here called the Handbook of Urban Economics that just came out. So I read a lot of niche stuff these days. In terms of general interest stuff, that is interesting.
Freakonomics tends to be a popular, good old Freakonomics tends to be a popular one to kind of test the waters a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of those. I mean, I think my book is accessible on housing. The Great Housing Hijack. Freakonomics is a good introduction to thinking like an economist. But you know what's really, I'm going to recommend 2 podcasts actually instead.
Oh, great.
And the first one's called The Economics of Everything. I'm going to tell you what it's called by picking up my phone here. I don't know if you guys know that one.
No, I haven't heard of that one.
Hang on. I'm going to just see. Economics of Everything, just ask those questions. A little bit like, it'll ask a question like, why is growing a thirsty crop like cotton in the desert the optimal thing? Or what is the economics? The last one I listened to was who buys top level domains like .com, .it, all those, and how are they allocated and how are they priced? Right? I mean, that's a super interesting question. So that's called the Economics of Everything, I think it's called. God, why can't I find any of them? And the other economics podcast I'd recommend is called Economics in 10. So Economics in 10 minutes. And is that really what it's called? God, I know these guys. It's about the life of these great economists like, Keynes. I'll tell you who they are. Gary Becker, Stanley Jevons, Robert Lucas, Hyman Minsky. So they're super entertaining guys, but they talk about, why in 1850 was this a big economic problem and why did this economist get famous, right? Why did Stanley Jevons write the coal question and say, the more efficient we are at steam engines, the more coal we use? That's a real puzzle. Like, hang on, you get more efficient at coal, you use more coal? Oh, that's because it's cheaper to mine coal when you've got a better steam engine to pump the water out of the coal mine. And so if coal's cheaper, you'll find more uses for it, right? Totally mind-blowing at the time, but that was the problem that was motivating him. And it talks about the life of lots of different economists at different points in time. And I think it gives you a really good perspective of, historically how big ideas in economics have changed, certain industries or certain policies.
Excellent. Definitely a lot of food for thought there. And yes, good call on recommending the podcast. I'm sure that would be a little bit more easier for people to latch onto. Ian has a fascinating question, and shout out to Ian as well because he's been paying attention this whole time. So he has a question that's actually related to something that we've said. We were speaking a little bit about how different countries have different policies in relation to housing. Is there is there anything that you can sort of see that multiple countries are doing? So like a common policy or a common thing, a common
Mm,
trend that is contributing to that housing crisis. Maybe like, oh, everyone's doing this and they should not
yeah.
be.
Um, okay. I'm gonna start with a few things. Just remember that for most people who own their home, they're not having a housing crisis. So 2/3 of the country own their own home, they're totally fine. They love it when the price goes up. And out of the 1/3 that's renting, actually only a small amount of them are having a crisis right now and are being priced out of areas where they used to live. And so I think you have to define the problem again, that it's not a problem for everyone. It's actually a problem for a small number of people, and it's a benefit for a lot of other people. You know, every landlord is happy the rent's going up. Okay, so we don't really want to crash everyone's home value. We don't really want to annoy 18% of households who are landlords, who are the most politically influential voting bloc in the country. What do other countries do? Well, the common factor of countries that have affordable housing for workers in high value cities is they have a huge regulated or subsidized rental sector as well as the private sector.
Mm.
That's the only thing I could find that is common.
If we oversimplify that, is that sort of like commission housing or social housing where it's
Yeah, right. So in Sweden, they have their national subsidized housing pool, and they've got hundreds of thousands in each city. And then Helsinki has one, and then Vienna is the classic one. It's a third of housing in Vienna is regulated at cost price. So, for example, there was an interesting media storm because one of the new ministers was still living in the house he got when he was 20 years old or something. And he was paying 400 euros a month for the subsidized housing. And they're like, oh, you're taking a subsidized house from someone who really needs it. You're a minister, like a government minister. And the basic conclusion there was, it doesn't matter if he's a government minister. Everyone should be able to have one of these. That's what we should have.
Mm.
It's not just a thing for poor people. It's a thing for anyone who needs it, and they can keep it even as their lives improve. And so if you look around the world, and here's the more interesting part, even in online worlds, I don't know who's a gamer here, but there's Ultima and there's a bunch of these online worlds where they replicate property markets in these massive multiplayer games, and they end up with the same problem: unequal access to housing, expensive cities that new players can't get into. And you're like, well, hang on a minute. They don't have taxes or anything there. What's going on? So a game designer friend of mine, Lars Doucet, he basically says, well, if you replicate the property system, so remember, we don't have a houses crisis, we have a places to put houses problem, right? Because anyone can go buy a caravan for 10 grand and park it in the CBD and have a CBD house,
Mm.
right? It's not the caravan, it's not the building, it's the place to put the building. And the place to put the building is this regulatory scheme called the property title system. And so if you want to understand housing, you've got to understand all the incentives in the property title system. Who's trading those pieces of paper. And that's a lot of what my book is about. So the common things are having big access to subsidized housing in cities for working class people. In small towns and countries small towns don't usually have big housing problems. It's lots of income inequality of people trying to all live together. That's where you have this tension, and that's where it's been historically as well. And that's how we solved housing. So between pre-Second World War, home ownership in Australia was 43% in the cities. In the countries, it was higher. And then 25 years after the Second World War, in 1971, it was 71%. So we took a quarter of people in the cities out of private rental into home ownership through subsidized home ownership schemes for 25 years.
Mm.
And that's sort of what has worked historically. And that's sort of what I lobby for. I mean, we have public schools.
Mm.
Everyone can have one for free. I mean, it's a crazy idea when you think about it. And we put them anywhere people are. Wherever you need one, we'll put one.
Mm.
Amazing. But houses, no, sorry, we can't help you if you get outcompeted for a suburb that you grew up in, and a whole bunch of rich people move to Queensland for some reason. Sorry, you're just gonna have to move somewhere else. Bad luck.
Yeah.
It's
Excellent.
crazy how different we treat that.
Yeah, I love as a way of kind of engaging the students and just getting to think outside the square. We sort of, compare, what if housing was like access to tap water or soccer fields or public parks? What if it was if it was it's arguably just as essential, possibly even more essential, than some of the
Yeah,
things that we get to enjoy for free. I'll move on to
exactly.
we'll move on to Juni's question. Broadly speaking, now over to macroeconomics. I will point out to everybody that unfortunately, we do only have possibly about 5 to 10 minutes of Dr. Cameron Murray's time. I'll try to get these last two questions in, and if
Right.
there is time, I'll close with a fun one of mine. Broadly speaking, now with the macro economy,
Mm,
what is the nature of the relationship, or what do you
yeah.
think the relationship is between the RBA's cash rate and the house and specifically housing demand? Is it as easy
Yeah.
as they lower the cash rate, demand goes up? Is it, or is there more to it than that?
Uh, yeah. It's
Mhm.
this. There's not.
Yeah.
The trick is this. It's not instant, right? There is a
Mm.
adjustment process, and these take time, and property is especially slow at adjusting because it's big, it's slow, lots of decisions have to be made, construction's really slow. For example, we currently have a record number of dwellings under construction, but incomplete because the timelines for construction have dragged out so much since COVID. And yeah, you're right, that we try and make house prices lower by raising the interest rate because there's an equilibrium effect across the asset market. Well, if you can get 5% in cash at the bank, but only 4% in your house for $1, well, sell that house and go put it in cash and get 5%.
Mm.
And the extra selling decreases the price till those rates of return equalize. So I do find that's a good question because what's forgotten these days, or these days, 2023 and 2024, is that it's meant to be expensive. It's meant to be difficult to buy a house. Like we engineered that by putting the cash rate up because we don't want people to keep bidding up prices and
Mm.
trying to all build houses at the same
Yeah.
time. Because remember, we had inflation and we had capacity issues in construction. So we said, well, let's make it difficult to do this by putting the cash rate up. We can bring prices down and stop people building. And now that's happened. Oh, prices, it's too expensive to buy at the current price, so prices are going to start falling, even though if we look historically, there's always this little last bit of a cycle when there's high interest rates and rising prices, and everyone
Mm.
gets baffled by it. But it even happened in the 1880s cycle in Victoria. So if you go back 140 years, interest rates doubled. So the rate that you could borrow to finance a property in Victoria in 1883 was 3%. Went up in 1885 to 6%. Everyone's like, well, prices are going to come down now. Interest rates are double. And then they went up again, the
Mm.
prices. And then everyone's like, oh, maybe interest rates don't matter. And then we had the biggest housing crash of that century afterwards. So there's this adjustment process. And so I think we're in a little bit of one of those now. You can see yields rising. So, the dollar of rental return per dollar of capital value per house is rising because rents are rising. So that's helping the adjustment. But we'll see. So you're right. There is a relationship, but it's not in sync all the time. It's like moving slightly out of sync, if you can imagine what I'm doing with my hands, if everyone can see.
Mm.
And if you look at historic, and that's why we end up with sort of cycles that everyone gets baffled by, but they're somewhat temporary.
Mm.
Something must adjust. Either rents will rise, prices will fall, interest rates will come back down.
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay, we do have one question, anonymous question coming in. A fascinating one. A fascinating one. Has there ever been any moral objections or dilemmas when working in economics? Perhaps when you're consulting with a firm or anything like that. I would imagine the answer would be yes, because economics is complicated and wants and needs are complicated. But does
Hmm.
anything firsthand come to mind, I suppose, of interest?
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story. I ended up doing some consulting work for a group called the Humane Society International. So they're a animal rights group, and they wanted a consultant to sort of debunk this report that the trophy hunters of the United States had written about why their fees for trophy hunting lions in 7 sub-Saharan African countries was the greatest conservation force there is, right? If they don't hunt the lions and pay the locals, no one's going to protect the lions. And so I did write a report for them, but we had a lot of conversations about they had a sort of ideological position that hunting is bad, full stop, right? But I was like, well, I eat animals, and I know that my mates with farms, when we used to go out there, they would have to hunt kangaroos because there's bloody kangaroos everywhere, right? Just like the water in the desert and the cotton crop, right?
Mm.
Sometimes animal populations have these abnormal cycles as well, in which case you might want to hunt them then, but then when the populations go down, you might want to not hunt them.
Mm.
And sometimes you have to hunt anyway, even if someone's not paying you for it. So um, what's happening in Kenya right now, because Kenya's got a really solid conservation effort for the large sort of trophy mammals. They're having this elephant population explosion. And elephants are really dangerous, right? They trample things, they stampede in towns, and they're like, we have to cull the elephants, right? And
Mm.
so they are now going to cull the elephants. And so these environmental groups are getting upset. I'm like, but I told you that it's okay to trophy hunt when there's this period of time, but not this period of time. And that's how you manage populations. This
Mm.
is what a lot of the um, what they call Bureau of Lands areas in the United States. So in the western half of the United States, it's just heaps of wilderness area. But they have this really well managed hunting regime where they do counts of bears and they do counts of wolves and they do counts of deers each year. And they go, okay, this year there's only 200 permits to
Mm.
hunt. And next year, oh, there's 100. Oh, and now there's a 5-year break on hunting these animals. And that works. It's totally fine. In fact, they reintroduced wolves in certain areas because they're like, we're the boss now. We're managing this ecosystem. We've got people living nearby. It can't just, have a crazy boom in some population. And then another example is there was a bout of elephant poaching about 10 years ago. And what's interesting is you take the tusks of the elephant, you leave the carcass. Well, the lions feed on the carcass. And so the lion populations were booming. And so then everyone's like, we have to cull the lions. Because lions are very dangerous to just have roaming around because they're territorial and
Mm.
they'll move into towns. And so there was a moral dilemma as they wanted hunting is bad, full stop. That's what they wanted a report to say. And I wrote a report saying, if we look to areas where the wildlife is managed and monitored, you can certainly hunt there. There's no issues as long as you moderate that when you can see the populations decline. And they never released the report. And
Mm.
they didn't convince me to say something that I couldn't find evidence for this being, bad. You can farms essentially hunt all the animals, but they replenish them, and so they keep this stock of animals. And if you manage it, it works. And anyway, that's probably the one that comes to mind because I was writing about it again the other day.
Fascinating. Excellent. Excellent. Thanks so much, Cameron. Thanks so much. I will ask one sort of quick question just to close.
Great.
More of a fun one. If you were politics aside, if you were a treasurer, if you could sort of implement or encourage or advocate for, whether it's a policy
Mhm.
for the Australian economy, or even just an issue that perhaps you feel is not getting looked at enough, or you're thinking, oh, we should really tackle that one. You don't need to explain it to us because we are closing. But is there a last, like, it sure would be great if we started looking at this because you can see that
Mm.
there's a problem and it might not be being handled full stop or handled appropriately.
Yeah, apart from just building lots of houses and buying houses and letting
Mm.
people live there cheap, I think one of the big issues in Australia is the superannuation system. It is just so big and
Mm.
the fees are so large, 30 billion in fees, almost as much as the age pension costs, and so politically influential. I think if I was the treasurer, and I've literally spoken to lots of politicians about this, I would give people their money back. I would unwind the whole system,
Wow.
um,
Wow.
and just give it back to people to spend as wage income, and and rely on the age pension, which is a very efficiently run state retirement insurance
Yeah.
scheme. Like for every dollar put in a bank account of an age pensioner, the administration costs are absurdly low, fraction of a cent. And for the superannuation system, it's absurdly high. But we don't see the inefficiency because it's not in a government budget. It's just hidden in these private companies. And in fact, those private companies, when they make more money, everyone goes thumbs up, you're doing well. But I'm like, that's just a cost for retirement. Just because they're getting the money, it's a cost to us. And we can't see both sides of that.
Yes.
So yeah, that's an issue. I've got a report called Strap Superannuation where I outline my journey. And again, this is, I'll bring it back to the start. You've got to have this sort of open mind. And so I was pretty pro superannuation about 15 years ago. When I had my kids, I sort of got thinking it's kind of weird that they're giving me a subsidy because I'm a parent and I'm a student, and I'm also paying 10% of my income to retirement. Am I too poor or am I too rich right now? Which is it? Because on the one hand, I'm being subsidized with welfare. And on the other hand, oh, sorry, you're too rich. You'll need this when you're old and retired. I'm like, but I don't need it then. I need it now. Right. And that got me thinking. I'm like, okay, super. That is kind of weird. Let me look into that. And you dig more and more and you're like, it's not achieving anything. Every time you look, you realize the difference between public perception and what's going on behind the scenes is so different. Anyway, that's an issue.
Brilliant.
I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. I definitely regret leaving that question for the end because I feel like I'd love to listen to you speak for another hour just about that because it's a very fascinating, interesting, thought provocative, thought provoking, policy.
Can I just say, I write a weekly newsletter called Fresh Economic Thinking. So if you go to fresheconomicthinking.com, put your email in there. If you search that site for superannuation, you'll get a lot of interesting things. And if you want to write an assignment on that or anything like that, get in touch with me via the website, and I can point you in the direction of other research.
Excellent. Well, everybody, I think that is it. Thank you, Dr. Murray. You are free to go. Thanks so much for giving up close to an hour of your Saturday afternoon. Thanks so much. I'm sure the students, and we are recording this as well for the people who are unable to attend. But yes, thank you very much. We'll chat later. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, everyone. Thanks for attending and great questions.
Okay. Gray, I might throw over to you. Is there any, I was planning with just a few minutes left, just kind of signing off and maybe giving a little bit of a heads up as to our next seminar. Is there any announcements on your admin end of things to go over?
No announcements, but we can just use this time to answer any questions that anyone has about the Australian Economic Olympiad. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them either in the chat or just come off mute and ask them yourself.
Yep, excellent. While students, while you are thinking of if and when you are thinking of Olympiad questions, I might just remind everybody our next education seminar, our next educative seminar is going to be on the 27th, 2 weeks from today, the 27th of April. Our featured guest is Tom Holden, who's a pre-doctoral student from the University of New South Wales. Tom holds a pre-doctoral research fellowship in economics at the University of Oxford, where he applies economic principles to analyze global priorities related to risk and emerging technologies. So if you are keen on that, stay tuned and come back 2 weeks' time at the same time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Justin. So yeah, I'll leave it for a couple minutes, see if anyone has any questions about the AEO or anything else that you want to discuss.
No worries. It does appear like people are signing off.
Yep. Seems like no questions then.
Yes, that's it. Wonderful.
That's efficient. Yeah, thank you, Justin. Appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you, Gray. You take care.
Have a good evening.